By some measures, America 100 years ago was as free as it has ever been. Government at all levels took up only about 8% of the gross national product. Slavery had been ended. Women would soon have the right to vote. American military involvement in other countries was largely limited to small interventions in Latin America for good or for ill. But the so-called progressive movement, of which both Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt and Democrats like Woodrow Wilson were adherents, began to think of freedom in a different way. The progressives watched the American economy go from being one largely made up of self-employed farmers who owned and worked their own land, rarely answering to government officials or employers, to one in which large corporations played an increasingly important role. Seeing the growth of corporations as a threat to their own power within the government, the progressives argued that the federal government should act as a countervailing influence to the corporations, ostensibly representing the true will of the people. But to act as such a countervailing influence, went the argument, government power would have to be as big and as centralized as the corporations themselves. This argument was not just popular with a handful of intellectuals. The science fiction novel Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy came out in 1888, positively depicting a socialist future for America, and became one of the most popular books in American history, inspiring book clubs and political organizations across the country. Many Americans of the time believed central planning was the only solution to economic downturns and the perceived threat big business posed to tiny family farms and mom-and-pop shops. And so in the early 20th century, financial power was centralized, in part through the creation of the Federal Reserve and the passage of a constitutional amendment permitting a personal income tax. Not to fear, though, objective, scientific federal bureaucrats would supposedly use Washington's new powers wisely and eliminate the corruption of political bosses, local machines, and corporate trusts. Presidents increasingly employed their bully pulpit to appeal directly to the people, sometimes to denounce or upbraid Congress, a form of demagoguery that had been greatly feared by the founders and most 19th century American politicians. The founders had expected presidents humbly to make periodic reports about their activities to Congress, usually in writing, not to make rousing speeches to Congress and the masses intended to stir up support for the president's latest initiative. President Andrew Johnson had been impeached, in part for making appeals to the public to rally to him and to oppose the Congress. President Woodrow Wilson, by contrast, used the newly expanded, progressivism-inspired federal bureaucracy and the expanded power of the presidency, combined with the new power of mass media, to rally the public in support of authoritarian measures, the likes of which America had not seen since the Civil War. Anti-war books and magazines were censored during World War I. Radicals of all stripes were arrested. Thousands of pro-war domestic enforcers were deputized, granting them extra legal power to beat and intimidate anti-war protesters or those merely suspected of promoting unpatriotic sentiments. Americans could be arrested for expressing skepticism about buying war bonds, even in the privacy of their own homes. The Sedition Act forbade the use of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States government. A German immigrant was arrested in New Jersey simply for playing a piece by Beethoven in public. Wilson also racially segregated the military. All of this was justified in Wilson's mind with an openly racist and imperialistic mission to remake the globe in his image of American democracy, a goal that still echoes in some of today's planet-straddling foreign policy ambitions. Further, though it is largely forgotten today, there was a big divide on the left a century ago between those who thought of themselves as progressives, centered around Washington elites, and those who thought of themselves as radicals, such as the bohemians and artists of New York City. The progressives praised centralization and homogenization and the rationalizing of society to a degree that sounds naive today. And there were no fans of immigration, condemning the disruptive influence of ethnic diversity. In contrast, the so-called radicals were in some ways more libertarian, believing that diverse individual experiments in art, in literature, and in modes of living were the real route to liberty. Some of the radicals experimented with drugs and frequented speakeasies. The progressives backed the prohibition of alcohol, a failed experiment in authoritarianism that was soon repealed. These two cultural strains on the left have since merged to a large degree, but it was progressivism that really put its stamp on the government, creating more bureaucracy and more regulation. There's nothing very bohemian about the Federal Reserve, or paying income taxes, or getting permission from the government to plant a garden or to start a business. Luckily, after this strange experiment in progress, America largely returned to normal, but many of the bureaucratic institutions Wilson created remain to this day.